Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Building a Better Training and Experience Examination. Our presenters today are Jeff Burkoff, who is a Senior Consultant here at CPS HR Consulting, and Hillary Ricardo, a Principal Consultant with CPS HR. All attendees are in listen-only mode to avoid interruptions to the session, and we will take questions at the end as time permits. Today's presentation is available on the CPS HR Consulting website and as a handout in your webinar dashboard, and we will also forward a link to all of today's attendees once the recording is available for viewing. And now I'll turn the presentation over to Jeff and Hillary.
All right, thanks. Welcome to Building a Better Training and Experience Examination, or just T&E. You know, it's just T&E basically. I'm Jeff Burkoff, a Senior Consultant here at CPS HR Consulting.
And I'm Hillary Ricardo, a Principal Consultant here at CPS HR Consulting.
So here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about, first of all, what is a T&E, or a Training and Experience Examination. I think when we start talking about this, you'll all recognize what it is we're talking about, but they go by many different names. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. We're going to talk about some different types of T&Es and different scoring methods. We're going to talk a little bit about why they're so popular, because they are extremely common in one form or another. But we're also going to talk about some potential issues with T&Es, the why maybe they don't predict job performance quite the way we would hope. And this might be partially based on some of the assumptions that we make. We make some certain assumptions when we're interpreting the results of T&Es, basically that based on candidate or applicants' responses to questions about their background, their education, their job experience, we're assuming that they do in fact have the KSAs and the knowledge, skills, and abilities needed for performing a particular job. And so we're going to talk about then building a better T&E, how you can manage the assumptions, improve validity, improve fairness, all of that stuff, build a better T&E.
So as Jeff mentioned, there are different names and acronyms. Typically what we'll hear are for T&Es is training and experience exams. Some agencies will refer to training and education exams, education and evaluation exams, or E&Es, or supplemental exams, SUPAPs for short. Some agencies also refer to their minimum qualifications, or NQ screens, or evaluations, also within the same genre. What's common across all of these, regardless of name, is that they're self-reported measures given by the candidate based upon their previous job experience, or depending on the kind of job, their previous education or training. The perception out there is that they're, and in some cases it's absolutely true, that they're fairly easy to create and administer. You'll also see incorporated references or verification requirements of the candidate, and we'll give examples and talk about that more throughout the presentation. These training and experience exams, typically you'll see them as what we refer to as close-ended. And that's where it's a forced choice response option. Either it's a rating scale where you can only choose one of 4 or 5 answers, or there's also another kind of training and experience examination, and that's the open-ended or narrative-based T&E, and we'll be talking about that as well throughout the presentation. Some agencies, when they use T&Es, really the reasoning for it is they want the candidate to self-certify whether they meet the minimum qualifications. Some examples here are the kinds of questions that you'll see, such as, do you have a bachelor's degree in accounting? Obviously, that's for the kind of an accounting job, but just as an example, or do you have at least 5 years of experience performing government accounting, or are you certified public accountant? These, of course, are just forced choice responses, typically yes, no, that all need to be in a line with the minimum qualifications as outlined in a class spec or a class standard. Again, these kinds are typically a pass-fail exam. What's more common, at least that we'll see with our clients in these T&Es, are used for a full exam that creates some sort of an eligible list where you're assessing candidates' knowledge or skills or abilities to perform the job. And if it's an eligible exam, typically what you're looking for is rank-ordered candidates that allows for differentiation between the more qualified candidates, the top scorers at the top of the list, and down to the minimally qualified or the lower scorers at the bottom of the list. Of course, to do this, it requires assigned numerical ratings or scores to those candidate responses.
So there were a few different kinds of T&Es, as Hillary was saying, and they're mostly differentiated by their scoring method. So one of the most common ones are the so-called point-based methods. And these are where we are basically assigning points to different types of responses from the applicants or candidates. So in this example here, we're asking candidates about their specific education. So they have to indicate, that they have a particular degree, in this case, a degree in geology or earth sciences, say what year they received it, where they received it. And then we're also asking about specialized coursework or training. So these are courses that were determined to be, helpful or, would have helped someone acquire the KSAs or knowledge, skills, and abilities needed for performing the job. Then they can indicate, where they got it and the year and so on. And once we have this information, we can assign point values to different types of education, background. So a bachelor's degree might be worth, say, 10 points. And then in this example, a graduate degree is worth 5 points, so half again as much. But then we might give points for a degree that's not in a particular field. So if they have a degree in some other natural sciences field, they might get some points. In this case, only 2.5 points, so a lot less valuable than a bachelor's degree in earth science or geology. We can assign points for experience as well. So here's an example where we're asking candidates to rate their experience performing a particular job task, like analyzing accounting data set, for example. So here they can indicate their years of experience or a range, like more than a year, but less than 5, more than 3 years, more than a year, less than 3, more than 3 years, less than 5, and so on. But also in this case, we're asking them to rate their level of expertise or their proficiency. So not just asking their years of experience, but also, the degree to which they performed it. They performed it independently. They performed it, with guidance from others or supervising others and that sort of thing. And then we can assign points to the experience. And you've probably seen tables like this where, it's got, the different time frames and how many points they're worth. In this example, we can see that experience is given 1 point for each half a year, so 6 months, up to 5 years, and then they're given just a half a point for each 5 years after that, and then it maxes out at 120 months, which is 10 years. So the idea with this example is that, I guess after 10 years, experience probably isn't going to differentiate those candidates too much, and the experience between 0 and 5 years is more valuable than job experience over 5 years, which certainly makes sense. We can also ask the applicants or candidates to indicate the amount of a knowledge, skill, or ability that they have. So in this example, we're asking them to rate their degree to which they possess each KSA using this little rating scale. Either they have none of the KSA, or they have some of it, but they will require guidance, or they have enough of it to perform associated tasks independently. And in this example, we're also asking some other information. We're asking them to provide a reference, someone who can actually verify that they have a particular knowledge, skill, or ability, and then indicate where they obtained that particular KSA. So was it in a degree program that they listed, or in specialized coursework, or through their work history that they listed? So we can ask lots of different questions beyond the just how much of the KSA do you have. But then we have to assign some sort of points based on their self-rating of the KSAs. So we would assign a point value to different places on the scale. So if maybe I possess none of this KSA, might be worth 0, and I possess some of it but haven't applied it in a job setting, might be worth 1, etc. Then we can go through and we can add up the points basically for the whole T&E. Now there are right and wrong ways of doing this, and we're going to talk about kind of a better way. And you need to think about how you're going to set a pass point when you're doing this too. But we're going to cover that. But there is another type of T&E that Hillary's going to talk about.
So this type of T&E that I mentioned, one of the first slides here, is this open-based concept, or what's called a narrative-based T&E method. And this is a method where candidates are scored based on their provided narrative responses, and it's to a set of standardized job-related questions that can be placed. These questions can be placed online, or in some sort of hard copy format where candidates can respond in hard copy. But the idea around it is that there are a set of questions that candidates can provide these open-ended instead of the closed-ended responses. In this example, it's based on analyzing and interpreting. And you can see that it starts with a very general question about describing your experience in analyzing and interpreting data, and pick an experience or experiences briefly describing it. But what's typical and what's recommended by us is that these questions really should then also drill down to very specific parameters that you're giving the candidates a framework in terms of the level of detail that they need to provide in their responses for it to be a sufficient response. So the example here in 1B is choose one of those experiences and give us the purpose of the analysis and where and for whom it was completed and the timeline and the kind of information, steps you took, the outcome. It's not here, but you can also ask in an example like this is what kinds of tools and analytical tools were used, that kind of thing. And the idea, again, is to give the candidates a framework of the kind of detail that we're expecting to see for it to be a sufficient response. One of the components of this kind of exam is that you actually need a human rater. So even if the exam is placed online, human raters will need to be able on the back end to review those responses. So having these specific parameters in this framework also helps the raters assess the responses and ensure that the candidates provide the specific framework. Typically as well with these kinds of exams, what we'll recommend is incorporating very specific and detailed instructions. So if these questions are online, for example, we'll let the candidates know that there's a certain character limit, or if they can type up their responses and upload it to a system or mail it hard copy, you give very detailed instructions down to an example of you need to use 8.5 by 11 paper, single space, 12 font, that kind of thing. The reason for that is it's also giving additional information to the candidate on the sufficient space that the employer thinks is necessary or sufficient in order to provide the responses. A one-page response is very different than an 8-page response. And so there's not a hard and fast rule in terms of the number of pages. You would have to work with your subject matter experts to determine what a sufficient amount or space or character limit would be needed to provide an acceptable response. As I mentioned, human raters are needed, and what the reason for that is there's some quality and some judgment that the subject matter experts as raters would need to take into account in terms of the candidate's responses. What we recommend is that for each of the questions, and typically given the level of detail in these questions that the candidates are instructed to give, typically we'll only see anywhere between 3 to 6 questions. Again, it depends on the job and the competency areas that you want to assess for the job, but we're not talking typically about a ton of questions. For each of those questions, you again want to use subject matter experts in helping you define the parameters of the question. But what you also want to do with those subject matter experts is then develop for each question a set of corresponding what are often referred to as expected responses or suggested responses. And what that is while you can't predict all of the different kinds of experiences that the candidates will give, what you can do is identify some examples that a qualified response, what that might look like, what kind of acceptable time frame or steps that candidate would need to mention in their response. And you would use your subject matter experts in terms of developing that for the scoring. Along with that, you would also have what are called behaviorally anchored rating scales. That's the example here, where it differentiates between what a qualified per question response is versus a not qualified or well-qualified response. And so along with those suggested responses or expected responses that the subject matter experts help define, that would coincide with additional and detailed information that would go within each of these benchmarks. For example here, the paragraph within each of these benchmarks are quite general, but for a true scoring, you would want to put in more detail. And the reason for this is when it comes time to rating those candidate responses, you want to make the scoring process as standardized and as objective as possible. And so that's the reasoning behind that. As you'll see later in this presentation, we highly recommend using this kind of a T&Es.
All right, so you probably recognize at least one or two of these kinds of T&Es. They are very, very popular. I want to talk a little bit about why they're so popular. Well, first of all, they're really typically thought to be fast and easy to develop, and that may be true. I mean, they can be relatively so, though I think they're often developed a little too quickly and without adhering to the standards for real testing. And it is a real test. No matter what kind you're doing, you're making an employment decision based on this tool or this process, it should be considered a test and does therefore need to be valid. They're also considered to be fast and easy to score, and that's true. They are relatively fast and can be easy to score, especially the point-based type, and they can be automated. So you can actually plug one of these into something like NeoGov, and applicants go directly in there, answer the questions, and then the system can score them automatically. It can eliminate them automatically or whatever you have it set up to do. They can also be good for reducing large applicant pools, very, very common use, especially with the minimum qualification screen. If you get 1,000 applicants, you don't want to bring in 1,000 applicants for further testing. You want to do something. So they can be. You have to be careful, though. You have to be careful that your minimum qualifications are developed and set correctly so that they are, at the right level for the job, so that they are valid and job related and all of that. Because if you're reducing a large number of applicants, it's easy to reduce people who actually are qualified. So you have to be really, really careful. It can be useful for reducing candidate pools too. So candidates. So now people that are in the system and you want to use it for further for actual selection, you have to be really careful though, because it really needs to be a valid job-related test. They're also really common just because they're sort of HR's standard procedure. It's just sort of like it's just what we do. A lot of agencies tell us they don't really do standard testing, but they just do T&Es or supplemental applications or something like that. It's just very, very common. Sometimes it's just sort of the go-to process. but we would suggest that maybe there's a better option. Because T&Es are so common, there's been a lot of research on them. Back in 1998, Schmidt and Hunter did a large-scale, a meta-analysis, so where they took a whole bunch of studies and combined the results of all these different studies of different selection methods, and basically how well different selection methods predict job performance. And then Schmidt, and then with some other folks, and Schaefer in 2016 did an update to that study and found overall over the all the years, they found some really interesting results. So this table, this is an abbreviated table of their results. It shows the validity coefficients for a bunch of different selection procedures. And so what this means is, so the validity is the indication of the degree to which each of these selection procedures will predict job performance. So the way a validity coefficient works is if you square it, so multiply it by itself, you'll get the percentage of the variance in the criterion, in this case, job performance, that is predicted by that particular selection procedure. So if you look at the top of the table, you can see the good old-fashioned employment interview, the in-person employment interview with the validity of 0.58. That means that, if we square that, that means that we're predicting 34%, so 34% of job performance. So what that means literally is that 34% of the variability in job performance is accounted for by that particular selection procedure. Now that's huge, because if you if you're doing anything where you're studying humans or human behavior, if you can predict 34% of anything with any one measure, that's really, really big. We generally, a rule of thumb is we look for a validity coefficient of about 0.3. So you can see that a lot of these selection procedures are quite good. And again, this is an abbreviated table, so there were more. But I want to call your attention to the bottom of the table, the very, very bottom of the table. We can see second from the bottom is the point-based T&E with a validity coefficient of 0.11, meaning the point-based T&E is predicting about 1% of job performance with that particular method, very low. And then look right above it and right below it, you see years of job experience and years of education, the two things that we are generally asking about in our T&Es. You can see they're all very, very low. So again, this is the bottom of the table here. Our methods that we're talking about are predicting really between 1 and about 2.5% of job performance. So very, very low. Well, so let's think about why this might be. There are, as you would imagine, some potential problems, especially with self-report measures. Any self-report measure has problems associated with essentially two different things. And one is the applicants or candidates being able to, it's whether or not they actually answer truthfully. And then the other thing is if they can respond accurately. So if they're not being truthful, what we get is self-inflation. Self-inflators, end up at the top of the list. If we're rank ordering the candidates, the people who are, less than honest will end up at the top of the list, and then the more honest applicants or candidates will be at the bottom of the list. So the problem is, two problems with that. First of all, we're going to make bad hires. So we're going to hire people who maybe aren't actually qualified to do the job, but also those honest people who, frankly, we would like to work with, they're going to end up at the bottom of the list, and they're not going to be considered, and that's definitely not fair. There's also an inability sometimes for people to self-rate on a particular KSA. Maybe it's a lack of awareness. Maybe they're not really sure how much of a knowledge or a skill they possess, or there could be a lack of understanding of the KSA. Sometimes our KSAs are kind of complex. We might have something like the ability to, foresee future consequences of current decisions or something like that, a fairly common ability. But if we're asking people how much of that ability they possess, it could be kind of difficult to really put your finger on that. And then sometimes our rating scales can be rather ambiguous. If we're asking people, how much of a knowledge or skill they have, and we're asking them to rate themselves on a rating scale that says, you know, I have some of the KSA, I have a lot of the KSA, or I'm highly proficient in this KSA. What does that really mean? It can mean one thing to one person and something to another person. Another problem is really the assumptions that we're making when we're interpreting the result of a T&E. So first of all, when we're asking about types of education and training, we're making an assumption that the candidate acquired the necessary KSAs through that specific education and training. Now, they may have, not necessarily a bad assumption, but how do we really know that? And how do we know that they got all of the KSAs needed from the particular types of education or training that we're talking about? We don't really know the content or the curriculum of each individual's, you know, educational past. We're also assuming that candidates with more of the education or training will necessarily have more of the KSAs. So if someone had a bachelor's degree, they're going to have more of the KSAs we're looking for than if someone had an AA degree, for example. That may be true, but we need to be relatively sure that there's a direct correlation between the amount of education and the possession of the KSAs. And I'll remind you about that table that we just looked at, and down at the bottom of the table, the correlation between years of education and job performance was 0.10, so predicting only about 1% of job performance. We're also assuming that the candidate acquired the necessary KSAs or just ability to perform the job through certain types of job experience or having performed particular job tasks. That may be true, and just like the education, it's not necessarily a bad assumption, but we are assuming that the job that the person had in the past was exactly the same as the job that we are hiring for. It could have been slightly different. If we are hiring for a particular accounting position, say, can we just ask if someone has experience, you know, doing accounting? Necessarily, it could have been an entirely different job. We're also assuming that the candidate had perfect previous job performance, that they did all of the things that we're looking to them to do. They did all of those things perfectly. They were a great employee. It's not necessarily so. They could have been a very marginal employee for 10 years, and their experience doesn't really count for much. We're also making the assumption that candidates with more of the experience are going to have more of the KSAs or more of the ability to perform job tasks. But we do know that the correlation between the amount of experience or length of time on a previous job and future job performance is actually curvilinear. It's not a straight correlation. And what we see is that there's a point of diminishing return. So the benefits of experience sort of drop off at a certain point. So maybe after 5 years or after 10 years, having more experience doesn't really help. And then I'll remind you about the validity table we just looked at, the correlation between years of experience and job performance, the validity coefficient 0.16, or predicting about 2.5% of job performance. So very, very low. So it seems problematic, but we assure you, you can build a better T&E, and that's what we're going to talk about right now. How can we do that?
So keeping these assumptions in mind, certainly before you go about developing the T&E, really what we recommend is having the agency ask a set of questions. So first and foremost, keeping that validity table in mind, is the T&E the right selection tool? Are there other selection tools that maybe will be a little more costly or time-consuming to develop or score up front, but that will ultimately really give you valuable information about your candidates and help you make a better hire, which in the long run could save you time and certainly, of course, and money. So that's something to ask yourself if your agency will allow you to do that. Also take a look at what kind of job are you hoping to use that T&E for? There are some kinds of jobs that lend themselves quite well to T&Es, even point-based T&Es. If it's the kind of job that requires a great deal of experience or expertise or licensing or certifications, that might lend itself better to a T&E than another kind of job, for example, a gardener or an entry-level gardener. I mean, that's really to be able to assess if the person can do the job. It's really more performance-based, and the T&E won't really give you the kind of information that you need to be able to adequately evaluate a candidate. So take a look at that. Also ask yourself, where do you want that T&E to fit in the selection process, and ultimately what's its intended use? You can take a look at your historical number of applicants or candidates in the past. If you are trying to reduce a large candidate pool or applicant pool, the T&E might be a better option. But if historically you don't actually end up with a whole lot of applicants up front, or you don't, after MQ screening, don't end up with a whole lot of candidates who are eligible to go through the selection process, maybe you don't need the actual T&E. It might be an unnecessary step, and you can go to a more valid selection tool straight away, such as maybe, a hiring interview or a structured interview. So those are things to keep in mind. If you do decide you're going to use a T&E, again, whether point-based or narrative-based, you need to decide how is it going to be administered and scored. Do you have an online system that you want to use? You need to consider the kinds of rating scales or the kinds of information that's going to be placed into your T&E. Can you consider the narrative-based T&E? And if so, are there subject matter experts who would be able to conduct that more qualitative rating? And remember this validity coefficient table. And the reason we're bringing this back is if you take a look at the bolded selection procedure listed, that behavioral consistency method at the 0.45 validity coefficient. If you remember our rule of thumb, we're looking typically for about 0.3 and above. That 0.45 has fairly good predictive validity, and we would recommend using. Now, as the researchers who came up with this particular table, as they note in their research, what we mean by behavioral consistency method is just that narrative-based type of T&E. And that's where it's predicated on the idea of past behavior as predictive of future behavior and giving some more qualitative but structured scoring parameters. So certainly this is something that we would recommend based upon this validity coefficient for you to consider. Ultimately, if you do decide that the narrative-based T&E will work for you, remember this is typically around 3 to 6 questions. We're not talking a whole lot. It's usually asking for previous experience, something pretty general up front, like the example here, experience examining financial data. But then we want to work with our subject matter experts to give very detailed and specific parameters of the kind of information that we're looking for, and the very distinct instructions that are necessary for this kind of an exam to work well. And then ultimately, if you're going to use, whether it's narrative-based or point-based, again, what is absolutely crucial to help you build that better T&E is to make sure your T&E is based upon a job analysis and use those job analytic results. As Jeff had mentioned earlier, a T&E, even used for the basic minimum qualification screen, is still considered a test, and it still needs to follow The job relatedness is outlined in the steps in the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures. But just as importantly, the reason you want to make sure your T&E is based upon a job analysis is you want to make sure that the content within that T&E, as well as the scoring parameters, are job related. If you're using a class standard or class spec or even a job description, while that can give you a start and a good sense of what the job is, you don't know for sure if that is applicable to all of the positions across the classification. You also don't know how thorough and accurate, or certainly how up to date it is. And that's what a job analysis can give you. So it is very important. And certainly, in terms of building a better T&E, you want to watch for those assumptions that Jeff went through. You want to make sure that your rating scales are not ambiguous. You want to make sure that you're using subject matter experts to help you establish the scoring and the scales to use and rating criteria, as well as setting the pass point, which we will discuss in more detail further on in this presentation. You also want to make sure that you incorporate at least some sort of verification piece to help reduce the potential for self-inflation of responses. We recognize you may not have time to call candidates, previous supervisors, to ask them if what the candidate is saying is accurate, but you might. And so you want to be sure to include that. And we'll give another example of that in just a moment as well. And just breaking down this concept of using the job analysis results a little bit more, I want to point out that there's a perception out there that folks don't have time for job analyses because, and well, it certainly can be, but because it takes a very lengthy amount of time. It can take months, even up to a year, and it's time that agencies, will often say, well, we really don't have, or staff availability. While that's certainly true for some kinds of job classifications that are maybe highly complex or nuances to the job or many incumbents within the classification, by and large, most job analyses from this classification can be done in a quite truncated time and without a whole lot of work up front. At minimum, what you need to be able to do is identify those job tasks that are common across all of the positions within the classification and are what are most critical to the job. Likewise, you need to create and identify what the underlying knowledge, skill, and abilities, or KSAs, are that candidates need to possess, or really incumbents need to possess in order to perform the job task. What you also absolutely need to be able to identify is when does an incumbent need to be able to obtain that knowledge, skill, or ability. If the knowledge, skill, or ability is needed day one on the job without any training, that KSA is considered a testable KSA. If it's once they're already on the job and training is given, that KSA would not be appropriate to include in your T&E. And then once you have your job analytic results, it's important to take those results and then move on to an exam development stage using your subject matter experts. If you're using a narrative base, you do want to take a look at your task and KSA results to help you define the competency or domains that will help you work with the students to shape the kinds of questions that you want to ask. If you're using a point-based T&E, you still want to work with exam development subject matter experts. You would take a look at those task statements that come from the job analysis, and if they aren't already, you want to group them into competency or domains. The example here is really providing customer service. Just for our example, we put 3 here, task statements of answering customer calls or providing information to customers or addressing customer complaints. Those are nuanced differences, of course, of job tasks. And for those of you who are familiar with job analytic processes, you'll probably have a whole lot more tasks. The job analysis process, as you know, is very defined and distinct in terms of how these statements need to be written. As a result, you'll end up, most likely, with a number of job tasks that they are getting at different things, but they need to be split apart for the job analysis portion. Your point-based T&E that incorporates task statements that candidates need to rate their expertise on is different from your job analysis, and they really need to be kept separate. What we recommend is to really avoid the temptation of simply taking all of your important tasks that came from that job analysis, likewise all of the important and needed upon entry KSAs that came from that job analysis, and just plunking them into your T&E and calling it good. That's certainly tempting to do, but it's not really going to give you any valuable information, and it's also you're going to end up with many, many statements, all at least probably to the candidate eyes, getting at the same kind of concept. So the idea around it is to truly base the development of your point-based T&E based on the results and exam development process, whereby you group your task statements that fall under a particular domain together and work with your subject matter experts as defining which of those statements do you want to include. You might not want to include all 20 task statements, for instance, or even KSAs that fit under one particular competency or job domain area. You might want to only pick 2 or 3 of the most critical. Because it's the exam development phase and not a job analysis, you can also, without changing the content of the task statement, truncate them or combine them so that they fit best within your point-based T&E. Likewise, we recommend also looking at those KSAs. If you typically only use tasks in your point-based T&E and don't address the KSAs, you might be missing out on some unique KSAs that really get at something that you want to assess of a candidate. So I would urge you to also take a look at those KSAs, compare them to your tasks, and say, are there any KSAs that aren't really getting at anything that the tasks are indicating, and including and picking and choosing those KSAs to also include within your T&E. So ultimately, what we really urge you to do is to make sure that you are thoroughly working with subject matter experts and looking at those results to help design what goes into that T&E.
So, and not just using our SMEs to help us, interpret the job analysis results and then develop the actual, exam content like Hillary was talking about, but also remember our assumptions. We've got to watch our assumptions. Again, we're assuming the candidates have acquired the KSAs through the specified education and training, but we're going to have to use our subject matter experts to help us determine, first of all, if that's so, what kind of education would be required, how much of it, things like, what's in a typical bachelor's degree program in accounting? Would that have, the right classes that we're looking for? And would any degree in accounting suffice for a particular job? Or, must it have included certain coursework, like coursework in government accounting in order to count? And we also assume that the candidates have acquired the KSAs through the job experience that we're asking for. So we have to use our subject matter experts to help us determine if that's so, and what types of experience are we looking for specifically. It might not be enough to just require people to have worked as an accountant, because the job could have been a little bit different. So what must they have done? I mean, what specific job task must they have performed in that previous job for it to count? And then would candidates have acquired more of the KSAs from more experience? So again, our subject matter experts can help us determine that. How much time in a previous job would it have taken for someone to have acquired the KSAs? Would it be 3 years or 5 years? And then at what point is job experience no longer predictive of, future job success? So, at which point are we going to kind of stop giving points for additional experience? Remember, I talked about those ambiguous rating scales. We're just asking candidates, how much of this KSA do you have, and they have to say, a little, a lot, and I have actually seen those. I am proficient, I am somewhat proficient, I'm very proficient, completely ambiguous. So we've got to use our subject matter experts to help us establish, what that means exactly. And in this case, it's in terms of, job performance. So how have they applied that particular KSA on the job? Have they applied it under, performing tasks under close supervision or assisting others with their tasks? Or have they applied this KSA to perform tasks independently, and so on? So we try to take out as much of the ambiguousness of the scale as possible. And then, of course, if we're going to assign point values to different, different types of education, we have to work with our SMEs to determine what those points are actually going to be. So what's a bachelor's degree going to be worth compared to, say, an AA degree? And then if someone has a master's degree or a doctorate degree, is that going to be worth extra points? And if so, how much? In this example, we can see that graduate degree is worth half again as much as a bachelor's degree. And then if they had a degree in a field other than geology or earth science, so some other natural sciences, it's worth some points, but not nearly as much. So in this case, if they have a bachelor's degree in some other field, it's only worth 2.5 points versus the 10 points in the geology and earth sciences. So apparently that degree is much more valuable, and our subject matter experts determined that that's really how people are gaining those, the KSAs needed for this particular job. And then, of course, we have to use our subject matter experts to help us identify a pass point. We can't just assign a point value to each place on the scale, add them all up across the T&E, and then just give people a score. I mean, I guess we could. So you could sort of rank order people that way, but a proper test has got to have a passing score, a pass point, and a pass point always has to be set based on expectations of job performance. So for each one of our KSAs, so if we're asking about possession of KSAs, for each one of those, what we would have to do is identify the minimum required rating for each KSA, and works for experience too, for each level of experience, and then combine those across the exam. So for example, some KSAs might have a pass point of 2. So for example, so this rating scale we might assign, so A, possess none of the KSA, might be worth 0. 1, having some of it might be worth 1 point. C might be, having applied the knowledge under close supervision might be 2 or 3 or whatever. We might decide that a particular KSA, like let's say knowledge of accounting, we might want everyone to have applied that particular KSA to perform tasks independently. So that would be D on the scale. So that would be our minimum passing, I guess, the passing level on the scale for that particular KSA. But other KSAs, we might not require that. Maybe we would only require people to possess the KSA, but not necessarily have used it in a job setting. So in this case, B, or if that would be 1 point, that would be our minimum score on that particular KSA. And so we take the minimums for each of those and then combine them across the entire T&E, and that's how we come up with our passing point. And then, of course, for narrative-based T&E, it's actually a little bit easier because we generally, as long as we work with our subject matter experts to identify what a qualified response looks like, or a not qualified response and a well-qualified response, then we can assign point values based on a response falling into one of those categories. And then, so in this example, you can see in a qualified response, 2 is the lowest possible score within that qualified benchmark. 2 is therefore the minimum passing score for each individual KSA or experience, whatever we're asking about. So then we would just multiply 2 times the number of questions that we've got in the whole T&E. And then we also, Hillary mentioned this earlier, we want to include some kind of verification process. So we want to ask the applicants or the candidates for essentially a reference. You know, where did you obtain this particular experience or education? Maybe provide the name of a supervisor or some individual who can actually verify that, you know, you have that work experience, or even that you have that KSA, that particular knowledge or skill. It's a good idea to let candidates list multiple references. You know, they might have acquired a KSA through education and another KSA through job experience and so on. And you can have candidates essentially link references to individual T&E items. Here's an example. We saw this example before. This is where we're asking the candidates to indicate the amount of the KSA that they possess with that little rating scale, the 1, 2, or 3. Either they have none of the KSA, or they have some but will require guidance, or they have enough to perform associated tasks independently. So in this example, anyone who says that they have enough of the KSA to perform associated tasks independently, so rated a 3, we are asking them to indicate for each one of the KSAs, like a knowledge of statistics, where they got it. Did they get it through a degree program that they listed? Did they get it through specialized coursework, or through work or internship positions that they listed in some other section of the T&E? And in this example, even indicate a reference that they listed in another section, someone who could verify that they actually have that KSA. What do we do? That's a lot of information. What do we do with that information? We could theoretically use it for real verification. If you want to make a whole bunch of phone calls and ask people, does so-and-so actually have this KSA? Most of the time, we're not doing that because we don't have the time. So it's an option. And it's something you could do if it's a really important KSA, like say, really important job experience, and you are later stages of the process and you don't have a lot of final candidates. A lot of the time, though, we will add these verification measures into the T&E just to serve as a deterrent. The idea being that people are much less likely to lie, essentially, or that self-inflate, if we know they might. If we're just asking them for a reference, they know that it's possible that we could actually make some phone calls. It also sends the message, too, that we are serious about it. We are so serious about you having these KSAs that we actually want to know where you got it. So that kind of sends a message, too. So those are the final tips that we have for building a better T&E. So in conclusion,
so we've discussed some of the most common types, different kinds of T&Es that are out there on their intended use and the value, or in some cases, not as valuable as we'd hope, the information that's derived from these kinds of exams. And we've also discussed some of the reasons why the T&Es are so popular, and particularly that assumption that T&Es are really quick and easy to develop and administer and score, and certainly that is the case for some of these T&Es, particularly the automated scoring point-based T&Es. Unfortunately, we know that some of these point-based T&Es do have lower predictive value, and that is a concern. What we would hope that you can take away from this presentation is certainly some thought or consideration on using the narrative-based T&E, which does have good predictive validity. It can still be placed online. It does take a bit longer to score because you need that human rater, but we hope that that's something that you can consider. If you are going to utilize the point-based T&E, that also can be a useful tool, particularly for the kinds of jobs that require lots of different kinds of varied experience, particularly in situations where Maybe you don't have a whole lot of time, but you need to reduce a very large applicant or candidate pool. And you can make a better point-based T&E, incorporating a verification component that Jeff just talked through, keeping in mind all of those assumptions that you have to take into account, making the rating scales more concrete and specific, certainly using subject matter experts throughout the process, as well as making sure that your exam is treated as an exam.